Hello, everybody, and welcome to the third Crossover Summit. My name is Mark Atkin, and I'm one of the directors of Crossover. As you can see today, we're using the hashtag #ExoSummit. So the summit is our opportunity to reconnect with all of the people who've been associated with Crossover. So that's the participants on labs and workshops that we've done all over the world, and our partners in making Crossover events possible. Since the last summit that happened here in November, we've worked with the Wellcome Trust to bring together curators from the Wellcome Collection, which is their museum, the Tate, the Science Museum, the National Maritime Museum, and the Parliamentary Archive, along with linear, traditional, and games producers to explore new ways of expressing their collections. And we've also worked with the Media Programme and Film Victoria in Australia and European partners to come up with and develop new ideas for factual transmedia projects that will be launching on the international market here at DocFest. And I'm really pleased that many of the participants of that program are here today. So over the past 8 years or so, Crossover's been working primarily with producers, over 30 or so labs internationally, helping to create the producers of the future. But the subsequent experience of these producers is that they often take their ideas to the usual funding bodies, TV and film funds, but never quite know who to pitch their idea to, since the way that media is funded is not joined up. So we decided to make the subject of this summit convergence, since whether film or TV likes it or not, it's about to become joined up. At the moment, the TVs are connected to the internet, which for most people in this room is just a matter of months away. Traditional media will realize that they will have to respond creatively to the challenge and that no one will be able to produce or commission for creative silos for much longer. The creative capacity is already there, the technology is there, and the demand will be there at last for converged media. The way Crossover will respond to this challenge is to work now with the help of the Media Programme to create 3 labs directed at TV commissioners and film fund managers that will build on the experience of running 2 labs for Channel 4 about the commissioners about 18 months ago. This programme is designed not only to support their ability to commission converged media projects, but it'll also make them want to actively seek them out. So I'm pleased to launch the Commissioning the Future programme here and now, along with our partners, the Documentary Campus and DocFest. So the first element of this programme is today's Summit on Convergence. And as of today, commissioners and film fund managers will be able to sign up for one of 3 labs happening in September in Romania or in October in Austria or in November in the UK. And you can do this at commissioningthefuture.eu, or you can register your interest with myself or with Flora from the Documentary Campus, who's over there. So today we will explore convergence from a variety of angles in a format that includes 2 panel discussions and 5 spotlights, which are 7-minute information bursts from practitioners of converged media. And all of this will be followed by roundtable sessions that will happen upstairs in Channing Hall over lunch, where you can talk in depth with the speakers for about 30 minutes over lunch, and again at 3:15. So the way that works, it's on a first-come, first-served basis. So when lunch starts, you'll see lots of tables with signs on them, and you just sit around the table that you're interested in, and you can talk in greater depth to any of the speakers here doing a round table, and then that will start again at 3:15 at the end of the session here. As well as featuring our panelists and spotlighters, there'll also be a round table with Alex Chapman, who's one of Britain's foremost lawyers specializing in digital media. So this morning, after the keynote, we'll have spotlights from Patrick Crowe from Xenophile Media, Paul Bennon from Something Else. This will be followed by a panel on how digital innovation is changing commissioning and production, and then a spotlight from Lucy Cook. And I won't introduce them separately, but I asked them that they all prepare to take the stage at their allotted moment. And this morning's sessions will be captured graphically by the DocFest artist Smiz over there, and then uploaded onto the DocFest website. But to start this program, I'm delighted to have with us to deliver the keynote Frank Rose, contributing editor of Wired magazine and author of the new book, The Art of Immersion, who'll talk to us about what happens when games and stories collide.
Thanks, Mark. Okay. I'm here because I wrote this book, and the book is essentially about how the internet is changing storytelling, and there are a number of ways that sort of all work together. First, it's making stories become nonlinear. It's making them become participatory, so that we can join in some way if we want to. It follows from that that they're also becoming game-like, because that's sort of what happens when people start to jump in. And finally, they're becoming immersive. And I think one reason I wrote this book, one reason I got started on it was because I wanted to understand the relationship between games and stories. I sort of had this intuitive sense that games were becoming stories and stories were becoming games, but I didn't really understand what that meant. It's obvious that the internet blurs boundaries of all sorts, and among them the boundaries between stories and games. But what does that mean for people who are telling stories? And what does that mean for game designers? How different games and stories, how different are they really from one another? And what happens when they collide? When they, do they morph into something else? So that's kind of what I want to talk about today. First off, let's consider, what are stories? Stories are basically, of course, a way to convey information. But information can come to us in a number of different ways. We can make lists, because we forget things. We can, follow instructions like a recipe, which is essentially an algorithm. Or we can tell stories. Stories are really the most effective way to remember things, because they give us things to latch on to, something to remember, a context, a framework for the information that we're trying to get. Algorithms work for machines. Algorithms like this one. They start with input, and you get output at the end. But stories are very different. They're not quite so, mechanistic. And, I would go so far as to say that what algorithms are to machines is really what stories are to humans. They're how we get information. But we've been trained to believe for the last 150 years or so that stories are essentially passive, that they're there for us to consume, but not to take part in. And so at this point, though, I think we really need to ask that question, is that really true? Or is that just a product of the technology that we were living with at the time? 160 years ago, we had the beginnings of mass media with newspapers like the New York Times. This is the first issue, by the way. It's from September 1851. Looks kind of like the Wall Street Journal before Rupert got his hands on it. And it's full of stories, all sorts of stories. Stories from Austria, stories from Iceland, stories from Switzerland, from Tuscany, and so forth. If you look carefully, you'll see that they all arrived by packet boat. This was really the beginnings of mass media. Newspapers, magazines, books, radio, movies, television. It's all one-way communication because that's what the technology allowed. That was the most efficient way, by far the most efficient way to share information. That meant there was not really a possibility of feedback. The audience was a consumer, and that's all you could do, was consume. So how did that change the way we tell stories? Let's look at advertising. This guy is Rosser Reeves. He, in the 1950s, which is really the apex of mass media, advertising was pretty much defined by this man. He was the head of Ted Bates and Company on Madison Avenue, and he wrote a book called Reality in Advertising that for years after became the Bible in the industry. Certainly it was the Bible of Sterling Cooper, the ad firm in Mad Men. And it was based on the idea of the unique selling proposition, that every product had something unique about it that you could spell out and convince the consumer to buy. For example, Anison. This is one of their more famous campaigns. The benefits of the product, they got pretty much hammered home. And you were offered fast relief for the headache they'd just given you. And the idea was that people would rush out to buy Anison as a result. But in fact, it's not so simple. And a few years ago, the industry started to recognize that. What we have here is a study that was released in 2007 by 4A's and the Advertising Research Foundation. And this study actually derided the input-output engineering model of the unique selling proposition. Sort of following recent research in neuroscience, it was becoming harder and harder to delude ourselves that we were really rational creatures. And certainly we were not just automatons who would rush out and buy the brand that gave us the most convincing message. In fact, our purchasing decisions are nonlinear, they're emotional, and whereas the previous model had been essentially think, feel, do, that we start by thinking, then we feel something, and then we rush out and do it. It's actually more like feel, do, think. First we feel something, then we do it, and maybe at the end we think about it, or maybe not. So, the further idea in this study was that perceptions were not actually created by marketers, or certainly not created by marketers alone. That they're actually co-created by the people who are receiving the message. In other words, we bring a lot to the table. The author creates the characters and the situations, and this holds for obviously whether it's an advertisement, a television show, a book, a documentary, any kind of story that we're talking about. The author creates the characters and the situations and sets things in motion, but we respond. We make of it where we will, and we make all of this our own. So what that really means is that the entire 20th century advertising industry is based on an illusion, which is something the ad industry is trying to deal with right now. It also means that whether we knew it or not, we've always been participating in the storytelling process. So that's why you have newspapers that are starting to look like this, radically different from what they looked like 160 years ago. That's because technology obviously has shifted again. Audiences can involve themselves. They can get in touch with one another. They can make connections. And media, the idea of media, sort of underlying principle, has moved from the command and control model of the 1950s to what my friend Matt Locke describes as call and response. Communication goes both ways. The call goes out, we respond. Now, in fact, this is not the first time something like this has happened. And you don't even need to go back to the oral culture of the bards to find other examples. This guy, in the late 1830s, was, this, by the way, is a portrait of him from 1839. He was 27 years old. He had already written Oliver Twist and a number of other enormous bestsellers. And he was a master of what had come to be known as serial fiction. Just like the iPad apps or newspapers or television shows, serial fiction was really a product of the technology of its day, and in fact, the latest technology. In the past few years, say in the 1820s and 1830s, England had been dramatically changed. There was huge amounts of industrialization. People were flocking to the cities. There were many more people who could read, and therefore a much larger potential audience. Paper had become much cheaper. Printing presses were much more efficient. There were railways so that things could be delivered on time and on a schedule. All of this was quite new. And so it created the market and the mechanism for a market. But the one problem was that a lot of these people were rather poor, and they couldn't really, as much as they wanted to read, they couldn't really afford to buy a whole book. But they could afford to buy a little book on the installment plan, say. And so that's what people like Dickens did. They wrote them, they published them a month at a time. Each installment had a couple of chapters. That's what you got. What that meant really was that it changed the relationship between the author and the reader. Dickens, this was really kind of an unforeseen consequence of serialization. It gave readers a voice. They could write in, and Dickens could listen to them. So much that when he started Master Humphrey's Clock, this magazine here, in 1841, at the age of 29, he decided to make it a weekly in order to, as he put it, to shorten the intervals of communication between himself and his readers. Dickens apparently liked to speak of himself in the third person. Now the question is, how much did he pay attention to what his readers wanted? And that really varied. When there was a situation when his story was faltering, as with, say, Martin Chuzzlewit, he would change characters. He would make some characters, put some characters to the fore and send others deep into the background in order to, sort of please people. But at other times, as in this case, this is Little Nell in the old curiosity shop on her deathbed, and it was becoming, it had become over the course of several months, apparent that the saintly Little Nell was not going to make it. This practically caused riots in the street, especially when she actually did die in the fiction. So much so that when a ship from England arrived in New York, it was met by crowds of people at the wharf saying, "Is Little Nell dead?" That was the first word that they got. And alas, she was. So we see that, like games, stories can be participatory if the technology allows it. What else is it about games? Well, they're obviously simulations of some sort. All forms of play, in a way, are rehearsals for real life or for something else. This is why kids who never go out in the playground tend often to grow up to be not terribly well socialized adults. Stories are, it would seem they're not that. Stories are something else. They're impressions, as Henry James said, rather famously in this essay, which was published in 1884 in London's magazine, the London Literary Journal. But was that really the case? Robert Louis Stevenson, a couple of months later, argued that, in fact, that wasn't the case at all. That you could never actually hope to capture all of life in a story. That really it was an abstraction of life. A story was a model, or if you will, a simulation. 100 years or so after that, 120 years after that, Steven Pinker took this idea a little bit further when he described it as a sort of a thought experiment in a virtual world. And when you think about it this way, stories have clearly moved into the realm of games. Certainly, that's precisely what happened with this game, the simulation game. This was first published in 2000. It quickly became the best-selling PC game in history. It sold well over 16 million copies worldwide at this point. And I spoke to Will Wright when I was working on the book, and he told me that what he really wanted to do was not so much tell a story of his own, he wanted to enable people to tell their own stories. And that's what The Sims was set up to do. This, for example, is a scene from the story of Kev and Alice, two characters in The Sims who were created by a student in the UK named Robin Birkinshaw. And Birkinshaw didn't do what most people did with their Sim characters. He decided to take away all their money and leave them destitute in a park. So they were homeless. That's why Alice is sleeping on the park bench here. And, often people who are homeless have problems. And Kev, in particular, had problems. He was kind of crazy. And so when he decided he wanted to meet someone, perhaps for a romantic encounter, it seemed like the most efficient thing for him to do would be to take off his clothes. This, unfortunately, didn't work. But when I talked with Will about this, this is how he described it: that we're building these models of the world, and play is one way in which we build models, but storytelling is another way, and that they're really two sides of the same coin. So I think this gives us kind of a philosophical framework for how to think about games and stories. But it doesn't really solve the problem yet of how the author can tell a story in a game, or how game designers can tell a story, which is something that video game designers have been trying to do for years. Pretty much ever since they got beyond Doom. The problem is that most story game combos have not really succeeded very well. And the reason is that the story gets in the way of the gameplay, and the gameplay gets in the way of the story. Now here you have a character from one of the most popular narrative video games ever. This is one of the Metal Gear series by Hideo Kojima. This is Solid Snake. In the Metal Gear series, Kojima creates this sort of genetically engineered super soldier, and he spins this tale of military delirium that spans about 50 years. As I said, immensely popular. They've sold about 20 million copies of the various titles worldwide. And the creator, Kojima, is considered very kind of an auteur in the game world, which is appropriate because he's a film fanatic as well. But in order to make his stories work within the game context, what he does is he takes control away from the player. He takes the game controller away for up to half an hour at a time, and the player is expected to just sort of sit there and watch it, which a lot of them are happy to do, but many of them not so much. So he's become rather controversial in the game world. And yet, I spoke to him about this and how to address this problem, and this is essentially what he said, that he really doesn't know what to do next. He understands the problem, but he doesn't understand yet, although he's trying to, how to deal with it. Now, what's happening is that whether you're a game designer or a storyteller, you're creating a world, you're creating a narrative, you're plunging the audience into the narrative, and the audience is obviously, as we've seen, moving from sort of a passive audience to a participatory role, from just interpreting it to, in some way, acting it out or internalizing it. And to really make this work, what we need is a new grammar of storytelling. It won't be the first time that this has happened. The movie camera, for example, was invented around 1890. And at first, movies were 10 minutes long because that's how long a reel of film was. It took more than 20 years for people to come up even with the idea of movie stars, which would seem to be kind of a no-brainer. Much less, everything that, all the moves that we take for granted when we're watching a movie today, like cuts and pans and fades and so forth. Certainly close-ups, which required an entirely different kind of acting. So similarly, I think if we flash forward 100 years, we find a new grammar of storytelling that's beginning to emerge. People who are addressing these issues that I mentioned earlier. The Dark Knight, for example, was preceded by an alternate reality game called Why So Serious? And Christopher Nolan, the director, worked with 42 Entertainment, a small company in Pasadena that specializes in doing these things. And what they wanted to do was to create an experience that would lead into the movie over a period of many months and would, among other things, introduce Heath Ledger as the Joker. And along the way, bring the audience into the story. So there are many, many ways in which this was done. I'm just going to give one small example. A number of people had applied online in the fall of, I think it was 2008, to become the Joker's henchmen. And they were directed through some puzzle to a website called steprightedup.com. And when they got there, they found these ratty-looking stuffed animals with notes pinned to their chests. And each note was an address in a different city. Then eventually, this note appeared. People were directed to pick up a special treat that had been left for a person named Robin Banks. When people Googled the addresses, they discovered that each one of them was a bakery. And when they went there, each of them was given a cake in a box. When they opened the box, they found the cake with typically sort of lurid icing on it, and a phone number written in icing on the top, and underneath that the words "call me." So they called the phone number, and the cake started raining. So they did what anybody would do in that situation. I think they tore into the cake. And what they found inside was a sealed evidence pouch that, among a number of other things, contained a mobile phone. And along with the phone was a note instructing them to keep the phone on and to wait for further instructions. And also to phone in that they had picked up the cake at their location. After each location had phoned in, the animals disappeared, and people were led through a rather convoluted series of events to another site, which was this one, another evidence pouch, along with a pair of jokers. So what did that mean? Well, that was yet another thing that they had to puzzle out. And once they did, eventually, it led them to screenings in several cities in the US and Canada of the first 6 minutes of the as yet uncompleted film. And in the New York screening, Christopher Nolan himself came out and and said that he was doing this because he wanted to introduce the Joker. The first 6 minutes is when the bank robbery occurs, and the school buses, the Joker drives up in a school bus as the bank robbery is in process, loads all the money in the back of the bus, shoots all of his henchmen, drives off into a whole stream of school buses filled with happy, screaming kids. Little taste of the mayhem that Gotham City was involved in. So this was a very elaborate, sort of game story combination. It involved around 10 million people around the planet in one way or another. And it cost about somewhere in the vicinity of $3 million to put on. So, not a small thing. And it was also, had the benefit of being an established story. Everybody knows who Batman is. Most people know who the Joker is. And a lot of people were aware that this movie was coming out. And the point of this, of course, was to make many more people aware and to, sort of suck them into the story in advance. So what if you had a new story, an entirely new story? That's what happened here in the fall of 2004. In that September, the season began. Millions of people across the U.S. Tuned into to ABC to watch what was essentially, to go back to Steven Pinker's analogy, a simulation of a plane crash. And what they saw, what followed, was a very convoluted story about all these plane crash survivors. What was really odd about this wasn't so much the smoke monster, it wasn't even the polar bear per se, it was that other shows go to great lengths to explain everything, to not leave any, sort of untethered facts, to not confuse the viewers. Lost took exactly the opposite tack. And when I spoke to Damon Lindelof and Carlton Hughes, the showrunners, the guys who ran this show throughout its 8 seasons, I believe, this is what he said. They create the illusion of interactivity because the show is ambiguous. Meanwhile, though, as the first season was coming to a close, actually as the second season was about to begin, there was a 29-year-old computer engineer in Anchorage, Alaska, who watched the entire first season on disc just before the season 2 premiere. And when the season 2 show came on, he got really, really, really confused. So he did what people do in that case, which is he went online and expected to find some information about, explaining what was happening. But he didn't find anything. He was expecting to find some sort of, like Wikipedia devoted to Lost. So what he did was he started one himself. And this is what he told me about that. And what I loved about this was the way that he unconsciously echoed what Damon had said, that it not exactly interactive, but it creates this environment. Essentially, Lost was transformed into a form of game. And something that an academic in California, wrote a paper describing as a game of social information foraging and sense-making. For example, a user in Pennsylvania started an entry called Mid-Air Breakup, which of course was the calamity that befell this airplane. And eventually, in minute detail, the entry described exactly what happened, on the show to Oceanic Flight 815. And then it went on as people, built more and more things, more and more facts into it, to tell the details of actual in-flight disintegrations dating back to 1954. The results were in 50 years, there had been 16 cases of planes that broke up in the air. In those 16 cases, more than 2,400 people were dead, and there were only 6 survivors. So the chances of 71 people, living through a single mid-air breakup were, as somebody observed on Lostpedia, quote, fairly astronomical, unquote. But yet, the willing suspension of disbelief survives. What happens, though, is that, like Dickens, the creators of Lost had a relationship with their viewers, and they valued that a lot. They listened to their viewers. They didn't, as with Dickens, they didn't always do what their viewers suggested, but they certainly paid attention. But they also wanted to go further. They sensed that there was a next step that they didn't quite know how to navigate. This is what Damon said. He said, you want to create a world that people can stay in, as opposed to creating a world that people can visit. We've only been about creating portals. How do you marry social networking to storytelling? And Carlton Hughes, his partner in this show, said, to me, it's all about immersion. That was the thing that struck me about Avatar, the immersive quality of it. He was feeling that, 24 frames a second, 2D storytelling is looking antiquated. If you could take that immersive quality of Avatar, he said, the 3D quality, and combine that with worlds you can immerse yourself in and get narrative content as well, you'd have an entirely different experience. But if we knew how to do that, we would have done it. So that's where we stand today, I think. Because of the internet, stories and games are moving together quite rapidly. It's 2011, and we're blown away by our iPads and our iClouds and all the potential that these new devices and inventions seem to provide. But the truth is that we're all really groping toward something new, some way of using these. And for all that we think we live on internet time, the technologies of the internet are in no more of a hurry to reveal themselves in terms of how they should actually be used than the technologies of the motion picture camera. It's an essential phase, this phase we're in now. It's an exciting phase. But in a way, we might as well be trying to tell stories, trying to make movies in 1911. People were feeling pretty good about it then too. Nickelodeons were so 1908. And they'd figured out movie stars. And they'd mastered the jump cut and the fade. But spoken dialogue was still years away. And color, it was hard to even imagine what color in a film would look like. So the question I'll leave you with now is, who's going to figure out this next step? Who's going to make the leap? Who's going to, out of the collision between stories and games, construct a new grammar that will make sense to all of us? And that's, I think, what we're here to find out. Thank you.